A very slow introduction to a forgotten time. It is not necessary to begin this story with a precise date, or with a dramatic moment, or with a famous name. Instead, it may be more comfortable to begin by slowly settling into a general sense of time, a broad period that stretches quietly across decades, resting somewhere between the distant past and the familiar present. This is a time before urgency became common, before clocks ruled every moment of the day, and before speed was considered a virtue. Imagine, if you will, an early century in American history, somewhere in the long span between the first European settlements and the rapidly changing world that would follow much later. The exact year is not important. What matters more is the feeling of the era itself, steady, quiet, and largely unchanged from one day to the next. America, at this time, was not yet defined by large cities or endless highways. Much of the land existed in a natural state, shaped only by rivers, forests, gentle hills, and open plains. The air often carried the scent of soil, wood, and water. The sounds that filled the days were not mechanical or electronic, but simple and familiar. Wind moving through trees, footsteps on dirt paths, distant voices carrying slowly across open spaces. Life moved at a pace that would now feel almost impossibly slow. There was no expectation that anything needed to happen quickly. Days unfolded as they always had, beginning with light and ending with darkness, guided by the sun rather than by strict schedules. In this forgotten time, people did not think of themselves as living in history. They were not aware that future generations might one day look back on their routines with curiosity. To them, each day felt ordinary, familiar, and predictable. They woke, worked, ate, rested, and slept, repeating the same patterns that had guided their lives for years. The concept of entertainment was also very different. There were no screens, no recorded music, no endless choices demanding attention. Evenings were quiet. People sat, talked softly, mended clothing, or simply rested after a long day. Silence was not something to be filled, but something to be accepted. Children grew up surrounded by the same rhythms. They learned by watching, listening, and doing. There was little separation between work and life. The two were gently intertwined. Skills were passed down slowly, without formal instruction, through repetition and observation. The land itself played a central role in shaping this forgotten time. Seasons arrived and departed without ceremony, yet with absolute certainty. Spring brought gradual warmth and new growth. Summer unfolded with long days and steady work. Autumn arrived quietly, offering cooler air and subtle changes in color. Winter slowed everything down, covering the world in stillness. Time during this period felt expansive. There was room for waiting, for pauses, for moments where nothing at all seemed to happen. Waiting was not considered wasted time. It was simply part of the natural flow of life. Even the concept of progress was different. Change occurred slowly, often so gradually that it went unnoticed. A new tool, a slightly improved method, or a small shift in routine might take years to become common. There was no expectation that life should constantly improve or accelerate. Early American communities were small, often made up of families who had known each other for years. Relationships were steady rather than intense. People depended on one another, but in quiet ways. Help was given without ceremony, and gratitude was expressed simply. Conversations were unhurried. Words were chosen carefully, not because they were precious, but because there was no need to rush them. Silence between sentences was comfortable. Long pauses did not require explanation. At night, darkness truly arrived. Without artificial light, The sky became deep and full, scattered with stars. The world grew quiet, and sleep came naturally. People went to bed not because it was a certain hour, but because their bodies were tired and the day was complete. Dreams, when they came, were shaped by familiar sights and routines rather than by overstimulation. Sleep was deep, uninterrupted, and restorative. This forgotten time did not feel empty or lacking to those who lived in it. It felt complete. Life contained what was necessary and little more. There was comfort in knowing what each day would bring. The idea of constant choice, of endless options, did not exist. Meals were simple and repeated often. Clothing styles changed very slowly. Tools were used until they could no longer be repaired. In this early American era, patience was not a skill to be learned. It was simply how life functioned. There was no alternative. Weather was observed rather than predicted. People looked to the sky, felt the air, and made decisions based on experience rather than data. If it rained, plans adjusted quietly. If it did not, work continued. This was a time when the past felt close and the future felt distant. People lived mostly in the present moment, not because they practiced mindfulness, but because there was little reason to think otherwise. The days did not compete with one another. Monday did not feel different from Tuesday, and weeks blended together in a calm, continuous flow. There were moments of difficulty, of course, but even hardship unfolded slowly. Challenges were faced one at a time, without urgency or panic. In remembering this forgotten time, it is important not to search for excitement. There is none to be found here. Instead, there is steadiness, repetition, and calm persistence. This slow introduction does not rush toward an event or a conclusion. It simply settles into the atmosphere of early America, allowing the listener or reader to rest within it. Nothing dramatic is about to happen. Nothing needs to be resolved. Time continues, as it always has, moving forward at its own unhurried pace. And as this slow introduction comes to a gentle pause, it leaves behind a sense of quiet continuity, a reminder that long before the modern world began to hurry, life once moved softly, patiently, and without demand. The land as it was before anything remarkable happened. Before there were famous moments, before dates were written down and remembered, before anything could be described as remarkable, there was simply the land. It existed quietly, without awareness of observation, without expectation, and without purpose beyond its own continued presence. This land did not hurry. It did not prepare for history. It simply remained. Early America, long before major events took place, was defined not by action, but by space. Vast stretches of open ground extended far beyond the reach of any single view. Forests stood patiently, rivers moved steadily, and the sky passed overhead in its usual, predictable way. Nothing asked for attention, and nothing demanded to be noticed. The rivers were among the most consistent features of the landscape. They moved slowly, following paths shaped over countless years. Their surfaces reflected light in a muted, unchanging manner. Some rivers widened as they traveled, others narrowed, but all of them continued onward without interruption. They did not hurry toward the ocean, nor did they pause for reflection. They flowed because flowing was what they did. Along the banks of these rivers, the ground was often softer, shaped gently by water over time. Small plants grew where conditions allowed, while other areas remained bare. There was no sense of design. Everything existed as the result of long, quiet processes that did not require observation. Forests covered much of the land, dense in some places and open in others. Trees grew close together or far apart, depending on soil, sunlight, and chance. Leaves moved slightly when the wind passed through, creating a soft, repeating sound that blended into the background of the world. This sound did not signal anything, it was simply there. The trees themselves showed no urgency. They grew slowly, year by year, adding layers that would never be noticed by those passing beneath them. Their branches reached outward in unremarkable directions, shaped more by patience than intention. Between forests, open fields stretched out quietly. Grass moved gently when air passed over it. The ground rose and fell in subtle ways, forming low hills that offered no dramatic views, only gradual changes in elevation. Standing in one place, it was possible to see a long distance, but there was little to see beyond more land continuing in the same calm pattern. The weather followed familiar rhythms. Clouds moved across the sky at an unhurried pace. Rain arrived when it arrived, falling evenly and without ceremony. Some days were clear, others were gray, but neither condition carried special meaning. Weather was not an event, it was a condition. Seasons changed gradually. Spring did not announce itself loudly. It arrived slowly, bringing slightly warmer air and subtle shifts in color. Summer followed with longer days, steady warmth, and predictable patterns. Autumn cooled the land again, while winter covered it in stillness and quiet. These changes were expected but not anticipated with excitement. They occurred because they always had. The land did not resist them, nor did it celebrate them. It simply adjusted. In this early time, before roads cut across the landscape, paths formed naturally. Some were created by repeated movement, others by water or animals. None were straight for long. They curved and wandered, responding to the shape of the land rather than imposing order upon it. There were no signs marking destinations because destinations were rarely specific. Travel was about movement rather than arrival. A person could walk for hours and see little difference in their surroundings, yet this sameness was not considered dull. It was simply how the land presented itself. The sky above early America was wide and open. Without artificial light, it appeared deeper, darker at night, and softer during the day. Clouds gathered and dispersed slowly. Stars filled the night in quiet abundance, unnoticed by those already accustomed to their presence. The land did not belong to history yet. It had not been divided, renamed, or measured in precise ways. Boundaries were vague or non-existent. There was more space than could be used, more land than could be remembered. Sound traveled differently in such open places. Voices carried farther, but were heard less often. Silence was common, but it was not empty. It was filled with subtle movements, the shifting of leaves, the distant call of birds, the soft movement of water. Nothing about the landscape suggested that it was waiting for something to happen. It did not anticipate change. It did not hold potential in the modern sense. It simply existed in its present form, complete as it was. Days passed without distinction. One afternoon was much like the next. Morning light gave way to midday brightness, then slowly faded into evening. Night arrived without interruption, and darkness settled gently across the land. The ground itself held memory, though not in a way that could be read easily. Layers of soil formed slowly, shaped by rain, growth, and decay. Footprints disappeared quickly. Nothing remained long enough to mark a moment as important. Trees fell occasionally, not dramatically, but quietly, after long periods of weakening. New growth filled the spaces they left behind. This cycle did not attract attention. It continued whether observed or not. The land did not organize itself around human needs. Rivers flooded when they flooded. Winters arrived when they arrived. The landscape did not adjust itself for comfort or convenience. Early America, before remarkable events, was a place where time felt wide. There was no pressure to move faster, to build higher,
were to reach further. Space allowed for patience. Distance encouraged acceptance. From one horizon to another, the land appeared consistent. Forest gave way to field, field returned to forest, and water cut through both. There was no sense of progress in this repetition. There was only continuity. The air carried familiar scents, earth after rain, dry grass in summer, cold clarity in winter. These smells did not change quickly. They lingered, forming a steady background to everyday existence. Nothing in the landscape asked to be remembered. There were no monuments, no markers, no symbols of importance. What existed did so quietly, without explanation. If one were to stand still for a long time, very little would seem to change. Clouds would shift slowly, light would move, shadows would lengthen, but the land itself would remain largely the same. This stability was not planned. It was simply the result of long periods without disruption. Before events, before attention, before history arrived, the land rested in this state of calm persistence. Even the idea of ownership felt distant. The land was not divided into neat sections. It extended freely, uninterrupted by lines or labels. Paths disappeared as easily as they formed. Water redirected itself over time. Growth followed opportunity rather than instruction. This was a landscape unconcerned with legacy. It did not aim to leave an impression. It did not expect to be described, recorded, or remembered. Before anything remarkable happened, the land existed fully, quietly, and without urgency. It did not prepare for change because it had no reason to. And in this calm, expansive stillness, early America rested, unchanging, unremarkable, and complete in its quiet presence, waiting not for history, but simply continuing, moment by moment, as it always had.
Ordinary people living ordinary days. In the early days of America, long before history books took notice, most people lived lives that were quiet, predictable, and largely unnoticed. These were not the lives of famous figures or important leaders. They were the lives of ordinary people, moving gently through ordinary days, without urgency and without the sense that anything special was taking place. Each day began much like the one before it. Morning arrived slowly, often announced only by the gradual change in light rather than by any sudden sound. People woke when their bodies felt ready, not because a device demanded their attention. There was no rush to begin the day. The morning waited patiently. Simple routines guided the start of each day. A person might sit up, pause for a moment, and take in the quiet of the room. The air was often cool. The floor beneath bare feet felt familiar. Clothing was chosen without much thought because there were few choices and little reason to vary them. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was uncomplicated. Food was prepared in the same way it had been prepared countless times before. There was no experimentation, no search for novelty. The same ingredients were used again and again, not out of boredom, but out of habit and practicality. People ate slowly. There was time to chew, to pause, to sit without distraction. Conversations, if they occurred at all, were brief and calm. Silence was common and comfortable. Work followed naturally. There was no sharp division between personal life and labor. Work was simply what needed to be done that day. Tasks repeated themselves with gentle regularity. Fields were tended, tools were repaired, supplies were organized, and animals were cared for. Much of the work involved the hands. Movements were familiar, learned over many years, and performed without conscious thought. There was no need to hurry, because hurrying rarely improved the outcome. Steady effort was more valued than speed. As the morning continued, light shifted gradually. Shadows moved across the ground in slow, predictable patterns. The air warmed slightly, then held steady. These changes were noticed, but they did not interrupt the flow of the day. People paused when needed. Rest was not scheduled, but taken naturally. A person might stop working, sit down, and simply remain still for a few moments. There was no guilt attached to resting. It was understood as part of the rhythm of the day. Midday arrived quietly. Meals at this time were much like meals at other times, simple, repeated, and familiar. There were no elaborate preparations, no lengthy discussions about food. Eating was practical and unremarkable. Afterward, work resumed. The afternoon often felt much like the morning. Tasks continued where they had left off. There was no expectation that something new should happen. The repetition itself provided structure. Children, when present, followed similar rhythms. They observed, helped when able, and learned through repetition. There were no carefully planned lessons. Knowledge passed slowly, from one generation to the next, through example rather than instruction. Time moved gently. Hours were not measured precisely. People did not frequently check the position of the sun because there was little need to. The body and the environment provided enough guidance. As the day progressed, energy gradually declined. Movements became slower. Work naturally came to an end, not because a schedule demanded it, but because there was nothing more that could reasonably be done before dark. Evenings were quiet. Light faded, and with it came a sense of closure. Tools were set aside. Spaces were tidied without urgency. There was satisfaction in having completed familiar tasks, even if nothing visible had changed. Meals in the evening mirrored those of earlier in the day. Food was eaten slowly. Conversation remained minimal. Words were not used unless necessary. After eating, people settled into rest. Some sat quietly. Others performed small, repetitive tasks, such as mending or organizing. These activities required little attention and could be done almost automatically. Darkness arrived fully. Without artificial light, the world became still. Sounds softened. The day released its hold and the night took over. Sleep came easily. Bodies were accustomed to steady physical effort and natural rhythms. There was no stimulation to keep the mind active. Thoughts drifted gently, often returning to the same familiar images and routines. Dreams, when remembered, were simple. They reflected daily life rather than imagination. Sleep was deep and uninterrupted. The next day began much the same way. There was no sense of monotony because there was no expectation of variety. Consistency was comforting. Familiarity provided stability. Over weeks and months, routines remained largely unchanged. Seasons influenced tasks slightly, but the structure of daily life stayed the same. People adjusted quietly, without complaint. Weather occasionally altered plans, but even these changes were accepted calmly. If rain came, work shifted indoors. If cold arrived early, tasks slowed. There was no frustration, only adaptation. Relationships among people were steady rather than intense. Interactions were based on long familiarity. There was little need for explanation or persuasion. Everyone understood the rhythms of life. News, when it arrived, was often old by the time it was heard. Information traveled slowly, and its arrival rarely disrupted daily routines. Life continued as before. Holidays, if observed, were modest. They did not involve dramatic changes. At most, they offered a slight variation in routine before returning to normal. Clothing was worn repeatedly, repaired when needed, and replaced infrequently. There was no pressure to appear different. Appearance mattered little beyond practicality. Tools were valued not for their design, but for their reliability. A tool that worked was used again and again. New tools were rare and unremarkable. The concept of leisure existed, but it was not separated from daily life. Rest, conversation, and quiet observation were all considered natural parts of the day. People spent time outdoors simply because that was where life occurred. There was no need to seek nature. It surrounded them. Evenings often ended early. With darkness came rest. There was little reason to stay awake once the day was done. Generations lived this way, passing down routines rather than stories. Life was not narrated, it was lived. From the outside, these days might appear dull or empty, but to those living them, they felt complete. Needs were met. Time passed gently.
There was no sense of missing out on something better. There was no comparison to other ways of living. This was simply life as it existed. The absence of excitement was not felt as a loss. It was the natural state of things. Ordinary people living ordinary days did not feel ordinary to themselves. Their lives were full of purpose, even if that purpose was quiet and repetitive. Each day blended into the next, forming a continuous flow rather than distinct memories. Time felt smooth rather than divided. This was a life shaped by routine, patience, and acceptance. Nothing demanded urgency, nothing pushed for change. And so the days continued, one after another, steady and unremarkable, forming the quiet foundation upon which all later history would eventually rest.
Small settlements and their unchanging rhythms. In the early chapters of American history, long before towns became cities and before cities began to hurry, there existed small settlements that moved at a steady and unchanging pace. These places were not designed for growth or excitement. They existed simply to support daily life, and they did so quietly, without ambition or urgency. A settlement might consist of only a few buildings placed within walking distance of one another. The arrangement was practical rather than intentional. Homes stood where they had been built, paths formed where people walked most often, and shared spaces emerged naturally over time. Nothing was planned far in advance, and nothing needed to be. Each settlement followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Morning arrived gently, bringing light rather than activity. Doors opened slowly. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys as fires were tended for warmth or cooking. The sound of footsteps on packed earth or wooden floors was familiar and unremarkable. There was no central clock governing the town. Time was understood collectively, guided by daylight, habit, and shared expectation. Everyone seemed to know when it was morning, when work should begin, and when the day was coming to a close. The sounds of a small settlement were consistent from one day to the next: a door creaking open, a bucket being set down, a tool meeting wood or soil. Voices carried softly, rarely raised, and usually belonging to people who had known one another for years. These sounds did not compete for attention. They blended together into a gentle background that marked the passage of the day without interrupting it. Movement through the settlement was slow and purposeful. People walked rather than hurried. There was no reason to arrive quickly, because arrival itself was rarely urgent. Most destinations were close, and most tasks could wait. Workplaces were often attached to homes or located nearby. There was little separation between personal space and shared space. Life unfolded outward rather than inward, with much of it taking place in view of others. Despite this closeness, privacy was respected. People did not intrude unnecessarily. Familiarity did not require constant interaction. It was enough to know that others were nearby, following the same rhythms. Daily schedules were predictable. Certain tasks were performed at certain times, not because they were written down, but because that was how things had always been done. Repetition created structure, and structure created comfort. Markets, if they existed at all, were modest. Goods were limited. Exchanges were simple. There was no bargaining drama, no rush to sell or buy. Transactions happened calmly and without ceremony. The settlement did not change quickly. Buildings remained in place for years, sometimes decades. Repairs were made when needed, but redesigns were rare. What worked was kept. Weather influenced the rhythm, but only slightly. Rain slowed movement. Cold encouraged people to stay closer to home. Heat reduced activity during certain hours. These adjustments were expected and accepted. Children moved through the settlement freely. They learned the rhythms early, absorbing patterns without instruction. They knew when quiet was expected and when movement was acceptable. Elders observed rather than directed. Their presence added continuity. They carried memory, but spoke of it only when necessary. Even social gatherings were subdued. People met,
talked quietly, and returned home. There was no sense of performance. Interaction was functional and familiar. The settlement rarely experienced surprise. News arrived slowly, and even when it did, it was absorbed calmly. Nothing changed overnight. Paths through the town remained the same year after year. Footsteps followed familiar routes. Shortcuts developed naturally and stayed in use. The physical boundaries of the settlement were loose. Beyond the last building, land extended outward without clear definition. The town did not impose itself on the landscape. It rested within it. There were no sudden expansions. Growth, when it occurred, was gradual and unremarkable. A new building might appear, then quietly become part of the background. Evenings followed a familiar pattern. Activity slowed as light faded. Sound softened. People returned to their homes without announcement. Night brought stillness. The settlement rested collectively. Darkness was complete, and silence was common. Morning returned, and the cycle repeated. One day resembled the next closely enough that they blended together. Over time, this sameness created stability. People knew what to expect, and expectation reduced anxiety. Life felt manageable. There was little ambition to change the settlement. Improvement was measured in small adjustments rather than major transformations. The absence of sudden change was not seen as a limitation. It was understood as reliability. Generations lived and passed within these rhythms. Children grew into adults without noticing a dramatic shift in their surroundings. The settlement existed as it always had, quiet, steady, and predictable. From the outside, such places might appear stagnant. From within, they felt secure. The lack of surprise allowed people to rest easily, knowing tomorrow would resemble today. And so these small settlements continued, unchanging in rhythm, steady in purpose, and calm in their persistence, forming the quiet foundation of early American life long before history decided to pay attention.
Work that was done the same way every day. In early American life, work was not something that changed often. It did not arrive unexpectedly, and it did not demand creativity or innovation. It existed as a steady presence, repeating itself day after day, season after season, in much the same way. This work was familiar, predictable, and deeply woven into the rhythm of daily life. People woke knowing what work awaited them. There was no question about what needed to be done, because it was the same work that had been done yesterday, and the day before that, and long before memory could clearly reach. This predictability was not boring to those who lived it. It was comforting. Farming was one of the most common forms of work, and it followed a pattern that rarely changed. Fields were prepared, planted, tended, and harvested in the same order each year. The soil was turned slowly. Seeds were placed carefully. Water arrived when it arrived, and growth was observed patiently rather than forced. The movements of farming were repetitive and familiar. Hands reached down, tools pressed into earth, bodies bent and straightened again and again. These motions required little thought because they had been learned through years of repetition. Muscles remembered what to do even when the mind wandered. Time passed quietly in the fields. There were long stretches where nothing seemed to happen. Growth was invisible from one moment to the next. Work continued anyway, without expectation of immediate results. Trading was another form of work, equally repetitive in its own way. Goods were exchanged rather than dramatically sold. There was little excitement in these transactions. Items changed hands slowly. Words were spoken calmly. Traders often worked with the same people again and again. Familiar faces returned regularly. Prices remained consistent. Negotiations were brief or non-existent. Everyone understood the value of what was being exchanged. Buildings were constructed slowly, without haste. Construction did not aim for speed. It aimed for durability. Each piece was placed carefully. Mistakes were corrected patiently. Manual labor filled much of the day for many people. Carrying, lifting, pushing, and pulling were common activities. These tasks were physically demanding, but mentally simple. They allowed the mind to settle into a steady rhythm. Work did not compete for attention. It did not interrupt life. It was life. Tools were simple and reliable. They were used until they wore out, then repaired and used again. New tools were rare and unremarkable. Familiarity mattered more than improvement. Workspaces were modest. There was no specialized environment. Work happened where space allowed, indoors, outdoors, near home, or near others. There was no sense of productivity in the modern meaning. Work was measured by completion rather than efficiency. A task was finished when it was finished. Breaks were taken naturally. People paused when their bodies asked them to pause. Rest was not earned, it was necessary. The repetition of work created a gentle rhythm. One action followed another. One task led into the next. The day unfolded without sharp edges. Farming tools were cleaned at the end of the day, just as they had been the day before. Goods were stored in the same places. Workspaces were left ready for the next day, which would be much the same. Building repairs were common and unremarkable. Structures aged slowly. Maintenance was constant, but never urgent. A loose board was fixed when time allowed. The sound of work became part of the background of daily life. The scrape of tools, the thud of materials, the quiet movement of bodies, all blended together. These sounds did not signal progress. They simply marked the passing of time. Work rarely changed with mood. Whether a person felt energetic or tired, tasks remained the same. Emotions did not alter responsibilities. Children observed this repetition early. They learned that work was not something to escape from, but something to accept. It was neither punishment nor reward. It was simply part of living. There was no expectation that work should be fulfilling or exciting. Satisfaction came from completion, not from stimulation. As the sun moved across the sky, work continued at a steady pace. Morning tasks gave way to midday tasks, which transitioned into afternoon tasks without clear boundaries. The body grew accustomed to this rhythm. Muscles strengthened. Movements became automatic. When weather interfered, work adjusted quietly. Rain slowed progress. Colds shortened the day. Heat encouraged rest. These changes were accepted. Trading slowed during certain seasons and increased in others, but never dramatically. Patterns repeated year after year. Building projects took as long as they took. There were no deadlines. Completion arrived eventually. Manual labor ended each day with physical tiredness rather than mental exhaustion. Sleep came easily. The next day began again, and the same work resumed. There was no sense of being trapped in routine, because routine was all that was known. Change was rare and necessary. People did not measure their lives by accomplishments. They measured them by continuity. Work passed down through generations, unchanged in form. Methods remained the same because they worked. The repetition created stability. Stability allowed life to feel manageable. From the outside, this work might appear dull. From within, it felt natural. No one expected work to define them. It supported them. As days blended together, work continued to be done the same way, without variation, without drama, and without interruption. And in this repetition, early American life found its steady pulse, a quiet rhythm of effort and rest, repeated endlessly, long before anyone thought to record it.
Long distances, slow travel, and endless waiting. In early American life, distance was not measured only in miles. It was measured in time, patience, and waiting. Traveling from one place to another was rarely quick, rarely direct, and almost never exciting. Journeys unfolded slowly, often stretching across days or weeks, filled with long pauses and uneventful moments that blended together without clear distinction. Before paved roads and precise maps, travel followed the shape of the land rather than the intention of the traveler. Paths curved gently, responding to hills, forests, rivers, and open fields. Straight lines were uncommon. A road went where it could, not where it was planned to go. People prepared for travel with calm acceptance. There was no expectation of speed. Leaving early did not guarantee arriving sooner. Arrival itself was not always the goal. Movement was simply part of life. Most journeys began quietly. A person would set out in the morning, carrying what was necessary and little more. There were no crowds, no signals, no announcements. The road waited, unchanged from the day before. Walking was common. Steps fell into a steady rhythm, repeated again and again. The sound of movement was soft and regular. There was time to notice small details, though there was little reason to focus on them. Distances felt long, not because they were difficult, but because they required endurance. A journey of only a few miles could take most of a day. Progress was slow but predictable. Animals were often used for travel, but even then speed remained limited. Horses walked more than they ran. Carts moved steadily, responding to the uneven ground beneath them. Wheels creaked softly. Harnesses shifted with familiar sounds. Roads were quiet. Encounters with others were rare and brief. A greeting might be exchanged, then each traveler continued on their way. There was no rush to speak. Silence returned quickly. Waiting was a natural part of travel. Rivers had to be crossed at the right point. Weather required patience. Darkness ended movement entirely. These pauses were expected. Travelers rested often, not because they were tired, but because rest was part of the process. Sitting quietly by the side of the road was not considered wasted time. It was simply time passing. Travel across water were even slower. Boats moved at the pace allowed by current and wind. There was no control beyond adjustment. Progress depended on conditions rather than effort. On rivers, the landscape passed slowly. Banks shifted gradually. Trees appeared and disappeared without significance. The movement was smooth and continuous. Waiting for favorable conditions was common. Travelers paused for hours or days, observing weather without frustration. There was no alternative. Travel rarely provided stimulation. The same scenery repeated itself. Forests continued. Fields stretched on. Water reflected the sky. Time seemed to expand during travel. Minutes felt longer. Hours blended together. There was no schedule demanding attention. Travelers learned patience not as a skill, but as a necessity. Without patience, travel was uncomfortable. With it, travel became manageable. There was no entertainment to distract from waiting. Thoughts drifted naturally. The mind slowed. Meals during travel were simple and repetitive. Food was eaten slowly, often without conversation. Night stopped all movement. Darkness arrived fully. Travelers rested where they could, accepting whatever shelter was available. Sleep during journeys was deep and uncomplicated. Physical movement encouraged rest. The next day resumed much like the one before. Movement continued. Waiting returned. Messages traveled at the same slow pace. Letters took weeks or months to arrive. News aged before it was heard. There was no sense of urgency attached to information. If something was important, it would still be important later. Journeys rarely changed people. They did not provide transformation or revelation. They simply moved a person from one place to another. Arrival was often quiet. There were no celebrations. Travel ended as calmly as it began. Long distances shaped expectations. People did not travel without reason. Unnecessary movement was avoided.
Waiting became familiar. Delays were accepted. Plans adjusted slowly. Even important journeys lacked drama. Movement unfolded steadily. Travel did not interrupt life, it extended it. The repetition of steps, the rhythm of wheels, the gentle movement of water, all worked together to slow thought and quiet the mind. Travelers learned to observe without expectation. The land did not change quickly enough to demand attention. Journeys were filled with empty moments, and these moments were not filled. Over time, long distances became part of understanding the world. Near and far were defined by effort rather than measurement. Travel connected places slowly. It did not shrink the world, it preserved its size. Endless waiting was not endless. It simply felt that way because nothing hurried it along. In this early America, movement was slow, waiting was common, and arrival was quiet. And in that slowness, travel became just another steady rhythm, unremarkable, repetitive, and calm, carried out across land and water day after day, without urgency, long before speed became something anyone expected.
Simple meals, simple conversations, and early nights. As the day in early America gradually came to an end, life did not shift suddenly. There was no sharp transition from work to rest, no clear signal that the evening had arrived. Instead, everything slowed naturally, as if the world itself were gently settling down. The air cooled, movement softened, and attention turned inward toward the simple rituals that marked the close of another ordinary day. Food preparation began quietly. There were no complicated recipes to follow, no long lists of ingredients to gather. Meals were made from what was available, what was familiar, and what had been used many times before. The process was repetitive and comforting, requiring little thought. Hands moved through familiar motions. Vegetables were cleaned in the same way they always had been. Grains were measured by habit rather than by precision. Fires were tended slowly, adjusted without urgency. Cooking did not demand creativity. It followed patterns learned long ago. The sounds of preparation were soft and predictable. A pot being set down, a utensil touching a wooden surface, water poured slowly. These sounds blended together, forming a quiet background rather than a focal point. There was no pressure to prepare something new or impressive. Meals were not performances, they were nourishment, plain and dependable. The same dishes appeared again and again, changing only slightly with the seasons. People did not hurry while cooking. Time was available. Waiting for food to be ready was not considered inconvenient. It was simply part of the process. As the meal came together, the atmosphere remained calm. There was no sense of anticipation beyond the knowledge that eating would happen soon. Hunger was familiar, but not urgent. When it was time to eat, people gathered without ceremony. Seating arrangements were informal. Everyone knew where they usually sat. There was comfort in repetition. Meals were modest. Portions were practical. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was excessive. The food looked familiar, smelled familiar, and tasted familiar. There were no surprises. Eating happened slowly. Bites were taken without rush. Chewing was unhurried. There was time between movements, time to pause without discomfort. Conversations, if they occurred, were gentle and unstructured. People spoke softly, often about things that required little thought. The day's work might be mentioned briefly, without detail or emotion. Silence was common during meals, and it was not awkward. No one felt the need to fill the quiet. Eating itself was enough. When words were spoken, they drifted slowly. Topics did not change quickly. One sentence followed another without urgency.
Long pauses appeared naturally and were allowed to remain. There was no discussion of plans far into the future. The next day was expected to be much like the current one. There was little need to think beyond it. Stories, if shared, were familiar. They had been told before, often more than once. No one minded their repetition. Familiar stories were comforting. Children listened quietly, absorbing the rhythm of speech rather than its content. They learned that conversation did not need to be constant or lively to be meaningful. As the meal ended, there was no rush to move on. Plates were cleared slowly. Leftovers were set aside carefully. Cleanup followed the same routine as always. Washing, drying, and storing items took time, and time was available. These tasks were done quietly, often without conversation. Light continued to fade outside. Shadows lengthened. The world beyond the home grew quieter. Evenings did not involve structured activities. There were no schedules to follow, no entertainment demanding attention. People simply existed in the slowing hours. Some sat quietly, resting their bodies. Others performed small, repetitive tasks, such as mending clothing or organizing supplies. These activities required little focus and allowed the mind to relax. Conversations continued in fragments. A comment might be made, followed by silence, then another comment later. There was no pressure to maintain momentum. Voices grew softer as the evening progressed. Words were used sparingly. The energy of the day had been spent. Darkness arrived fully. Without artificial lighting, the night settled in completely. The sky outside turned deep and still. As darkness spread, the body recognized the time for rest. There was no resistance to sleep. Staying awake served no purpose. People prepared for bed without hurry. Movements were slow and deliberate. The same steps were followed each night. Clothing was set aside. Sleeping spaces were made ready. There was comfort in the familiarity of these actions. Before sleep, there was often a moment of stillness, a pause where nothing needed to be done. Thoughts drifted gently, without direction. The mind did not replay the day in detail. There was little to analyze. The day had been ordinary and complete. Sleep arrived naturally. It did not need to be forced. Physical effort and quiet evenings prepared the body well. Dreams, if they came, were simple and slow. They reflected everyday life rather than imagination. The night passed quietly. Darkness remained undisturbed. Morning would return, and the cycle would begin again. These simple meals, simple conversations, and early nights were not seen as limited or lacking. They were sufficient. Life did not require stimulation to feel full. Familiar routines provided stability. There was no sense of missing something else. There was no comparison to another way of living. Evenings did not stretch late into the night. There was no reason to push beyond natural limits. Rest was valued, not because it was discussed, but because it was necessary. Generations lived this way, repeating the same gentle patterns. The predictability of evenings made life feel steady. Each day ended peacefully. In this early American time, nights belonged to rest, silence, and renewal. And so, as the sun set and the land grew quiet, people moved easily into sleep, carried by simple meals, unhurried conversations, and the calm certainty that tomorrow would arrive much the same as today.
Seasons passing without urgency. In early American life, seasons did not arrive with drama or announcement. They did not interrupt daily routines or demand attention. Instead, they moved quietly, one into the next, following patterns so familiar that they were rarely discussed. Time passed not in sudden changes, but in slow, steady shifts
that unfolded almost without notice. Spring came gently. It did not appear all at once, nor did it signal a dramatic beginning. The air grew slightly softer. The cold loosened its grip, not suddenly, but gradually, day by day. People noticed the change without comment, adjusting their clothing and routines almost unconsciously. The ground softened as well. Snow, where it had lingered, melted slowly into the soil. Paths became damp, then firm again. Nothing needed to be announced. Spring did not require celebration. It simply arrived. Work adjusted quietly. Tasks that had paused during colder months resumed without excitement. The same motions returned, the same tools were used, and the same rhythms continued. There was no sense of renewal as an idea. There was only continuation. Light changed during spring. Days lengthened slowly, adding minutes rather than hours. Mornings grew brighter earlier. Evenings lasted slightly longer. These changes were noticed only in passing. People did not speak often about the season. There was little reason to. Spring was expected, just as it had been the year before. As spring settled in, the landscape showed subtle signs of growth. Green appeared slowly, not in bursts, but in steady progression. Leaves returned to branches quietly. Grass thickened gradually. These changes did not interrupt daily life. Rain arrived when it arrived. Sometimes it lasted briefly, sometimes longer. Rain was not welcomed or resented. It was accepted. Spring moved forward at its own pace, without urgency, without pressure, and without instruction. Summer followed in much the same way. There was no clear boundary where spring ended and summer began. The shift happened over time, through warmer days and more consistent light. Summer did not feel busy, it felt steady. Days were longer, but they did not feel crowded. Work continued as usual, shaped slightly by heat and light. People rose early, not because they planned to, but because daylight made it natural. Rest came when needed. The body adjusted without complaint. The warmth of summer settled into routines. Movement slowed during the hottest parts of the day. Tasks shifted slightly, but did not change in nature. Fields, forests, and open spaces looked much the same from day to day. Growth continued, but it was gradual and largely invisible. Nothing seemed to rush toward completion. Summer evenings stretched gently. Light faded slowly, allowing activities to conclude naturally. There was no pressure to make use of the extra hours. They simply existed. Conversations remained quiet. Meals remained simple. Sleep came easily. As summer passed, it did so without ceremony. No one marked its midpoint or counted the days remaining. It lingered, then gradually gave way. Autumn arrived in a similar fashion. The air cooled slightly, light softened, colors shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. There was no sudden transformation. Leaves changed over time, one shade at a time. Some fell early, others later. The ground collected them quietly. Autumn did not demand reflection. It did not encourage urgency. It signaled preparation, but preparation was routine, not rushed. Tasks adjusted again. Work moved at a familiar pace. There was no sense of finality. Life continued. Food reflected the season, but only slightly. The same meals were prepared with minor variations. Nothing required discussion. Days shortened gradually. Darkness arrived earlier, but this did not disrupt routines. Evenings simply began sooner. Autumn passed quietly. It did not announce its end. It faded into colder air and longer nights. Winter followed, not as an event, but as a condition. Cold settled in gradually. The land slowed further.
Snow arrived sometimes, covering the ground softly. Other times, winter remained dry and still. Either way, movement adjusted without complaint. Work slowed naturally. Tasks took longer or paused entirely. Rest increased, not by choice, but by necessity. Winter days felt shorter, but not empty. Light was limited, but sufficient. Darkness encouraged rest. People spent more time indoors, but life did not feel confined. Indoor routines were as familiar as outdoor ones. Sounds softened further in winter. Movement was quieter. Silence became more common. Evenings came early. Nights were long. Sleep was deep. Winter did not feel endless. It simply felt steady. As weeks passed, the cold slowly eased. The cycle prepared to begin again. No one counted down to spring. It arrived when it arrived. Seasons passed without urgency because there was no reason to hurry them. They followed their course regardless of attention. Time did not push forward. It flowed. People adjusted quietly without expectation of novelty or change. Years passed in this way. Seasons repeated themselves with remarkable consistency. Memories were not attached to specific dates or seasonal markers. Life was remembered as a flow rather than a series of moments. There was comfort in predictability. Knowing what would come next reduced uncertainty. The land did not surprise. The weather did not shock. Change was gradual. Seasons were not milestones. They were background. Children grew older without noticing the passage of time in years. They measured it in repetition. Elders observed seasons as they always had, without urgency, without anticipation. Life did not speed up or slow down dramatically with the seasons. It adjusted gently. Each season carried into the next without interruption. Spring followed winter. Summer followed spring. Autumn followed summer. Winter followed autumn. And then it happened again. This quiet passage of time formed the foundation of early American life. It shaped expectations, routines, and rest. Nothing needed to be rushed because nothing needed to be completed quickly. Time was patient. And in that patience, life moved forward, slowly, steadily, and without urgency, as the seasons passed, one after another, exactly as they always had.
Small historical changes that took years to notice. In early American life, history did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself through dramatic events or sudden transformations. Instead, it moved quietly, almost invisibly, through small changes that unfolded so slowly they were rarely noticed at the time. What later generations would describe as historical development felt, to the people living through it, like nothing more than ordinary life continuing in its familiar way. Most changes began without intention. They were not planned, discussed, or anticipated. They simply happened, one small adjustment at a time, blending so seamlessly into daily routines that they felt indistinguishable from what had always been. A new habit might appear quietly. Someone might begin using a slightly different tool, not because it was better, but because it was available. At first, no one commented on it. Over time, others adopted the same tool, and eventually it became common. No one remembered exactly when the change occurred. Buildings changed in much the same way. A new construction method might be used for a single wall or roof. It did not alter the appearance of the settlement dramatically. It simply became part of how things were done. Roads slowly improved, not through organized effort, but through repeated use. Paths became clearer where people walked more often. Stones shifted, ground flattened. These changes took years, and no single moment marked their completion.
Communication changed gradually as well. Letters became slightly more common. Words traveled a bit farther than before. Still, news remained slow. Information did not rush into people's lives. It arrived gently, when it arrived at all. People adapted without thinking about adaptation. They did not consider themselves part of progress. They were simply responding to what worked. Tools became more reliable over time, but rarely more complex. Improvements were modest. A handle fit more comfortably. A blade lasted longer. These differences mattered only in practice, not in discussion. Work routines shifted slightly as a result. Tasks became marginally easier or slightly more efficient, but not enough to change the structure of the day. Work still began and ended the same way. Farming methods evolved slowly as well. Soil was treated a little differently. Crops were rotated in small ways. Results appeared gradually, often noticed only after many seasons. Even these changes did not feel significant. They blended into routine. Life continued. Trade expanded quietly. Goods traveled a bit farther. New items appeared occasionally, but they did not replace existing ones quickly. Old habits remained dominant. Settlements grew slowly, sometimes without realizing it. A new home appeared, then another. Space filled in gently. There was no sense of expansion, only continuation. Population increased over long periods, but daily life remained unchanged. More people shared the same routines. The rhythm did not shift. Language evolved subtly. Words changed pronunciation. Phrases shifted meaning. These changes happened naturally, without instruction. No one corrected them. No one noticed them. Customs adjusted slowly. Small behaviors changed over generations rather than years. What felt natural to one generation felt slightly old-fashioned to the next. Time itself was not measured differently. Days still began with light and ended with darkness. Seasons still passed predictably. The idea of improvement existed, but it was not urgent. There was no pressure to innovate. Stability was valued more than change. Rules and systems developed quietly. Agreements formed over time. Expectations became shared through repetition rather than enforcement. Even governance evolved slowly. Decisions were made locally. Authority was familiar rather than distant. Structures solidified without ceremony. People rarely spoke about these changes. They did not frame them as history. They simply lived with them. Memory worked differently in this slow-moving world. People remembered routines more than events. Change was noticed only when it was complete. By the time a shift became visible, it felt as though it had always been that way. This made historical change feel invisible. There was no clear before and after. There was only gradual adjustment. Technology did not disrupt life. It blended into it. New practices replaced old ones quietly, without resistance or excitement. People did not feel left behind. There was nothing to catch up to. Time stretched long. Years passed without clear markers. Life felt continuous. Generations overlapped. Knowledge transferred slowly. Children learned new ways without realizing they were new. Elders observed change without urgency. Nothing felt sudden. Nothing felt transformative. Yet over long periods, these small changes accumulated. What once seemed familiar eventually became distant memory. Still, at no point did life feel unsettled. History advanced quietly, without drawing attention to itself. This is why these changes took years to notice. They did not interrupt daily life. They moved beneath it. People adapted naturally, without effort. The absence of drama allowed stability to remain. Progress did not replace routine. It rested within it. Looking back, it is possible to identify these developments and describe them as historical change, but at the time, they felt like nothing at all. Life continued. Days followed days. Work was done. Meals were eaten. Seasons passed. And slowly, without anyone stopping to observe it, the world shifted, just enough to be different, but never enough to feel new. This was how history moved in early America, quietly, patiently, and without urgency, through small changes that took years to notice and even longer to understand.
Time moved on. It did not hurry. It did not announce itself. It simply continued in the same steady, unchanging rhythm that had carried people, settlements, seasons, and work for generations. One day followed the next, and one year blended into the next without drama, without spectacle, and without sudden transformation. The world did not pause for recognition, and yet it continued all the same. People lived within time rather than alongside it. They experienced its passing slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the movement of the sun across the sky, in the subtle changes of light and shadow, in the quiet alterations of the landscape. Nothing demanded their attention, nothing drew their notice, and yet over long stretches of years, time left traces. Homes aged slowly, walls darkened from repeated exposure to sun and rain, roofs sagged imperceptibly, fences settled into the soil. These changes were gradual, so gradual that daily life proceeded without acknowledgement. Children who grew into adults observed these alterations with only casual curiosity. Elders who had seen them unfold over decades recognized them without comment. They were ordinary marks left by time. The land itself changed at its own pace. Rivers shifted slightly, carving channels ever so gradually. Trees grew taller, then slower, then sometimes toppled quietly in storms. Fields thickened with grass, were thinned through repeated use. The seasons continued to cycle with gentle predictability. Spring arrived, followed by summer, autumn, and winter, again and again. And as each season passed, time continued its quiet work, leaving the world familiar yet subtly altered. Daily routines persisted unchanged. People woke, worked, ate, rested, and slept with the same patience they had always practiced. Work was repetitive, meals were simple, conversations drifted slowly. Travel took long days, and journeys were filled with quiet pauses. Nothing rushed, nothing forced itself forward. Time simply enveloped all activities, moving steadily alongside them. The rhythm of ordinary life remained intact. Sometimes small developments occurred, so minor that they were barely recognized as change. A tool might be slightly improved. A path became smoother where footsteps had repeated most often. Crops were rotated differently. Letters traveled slightly farther. These adjustments happened without fanfare, without announcement, and without expectation. They were the quiet fingerprints of history upon life, noticed only after long periods, and even then only in reflection. People did not frame these moments as historical. They did not know that they were witnesses to what would one day be considered development or evolution. The word history was not in their minds. All that existed was the continuity of daily life, marked by steady repetition and gentle progression. They lived, and time moved quietly past them. Generations came and went. Children grew into adults, learned familiar routines, and took their places in the cycles of work, meals, rest, and travel. Parents aged alongside them, observing changes slowly, but never feeling that the world itself had altered dramatically. The same landscape provided the backdrop for life, repeated through decades. Settlements, modest and unassuming, grew just enough to accommodate new members, yet preserved the same unhurried character. Time left no dramatic signposts. There were no sudden inventions, no immediate transformations, no abrupt shifts in culture or technology. Changes were incremental, almost invisible,
Life persisted as it always had, yet when looked back upon after many years, subtle differences became apparent. Tools had improved slightly, crops were slightly more abundant, roads slightly better defined, and households slightly more organized. History unfolded in soft, unremarkable steps. People accepted the slow movement of life. There was no frustration at the absence of speed. There was no disappointment at the lack of excitement. Comfort was found in routine. Predictability provided a sense of security. Days passed, weeks followed, months rolled into years, and years expanded into decades. Time continued its quiet march, leaving individuals to live, age, and pass along the same ordinary practices that defined early American life. Even as time moved forward, there was an awareness of continuity. Children inherited the habits of their parents, and their children in turn inherited the same patterns. Knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation. Work practices, meals, social interactions, and seasonal routines remained familiar. Innovations were gradual, almost imperceptible, and yet their accumulation over long periods marked subtle progress. Time itself worked slowly, carefully, without drawing attention to its effects. Seasons repeated their gentle cycles. Spring returned after winter, summer after spring, autumn after summer, winter after autumn, again and again. And as each season passed, time continued its quiet work, leaving the world familiar yet subtly altered. Daily routines persisted unchanged. People woke, worked, ate, rested, and slept with the same patience they had always practiced. Work was repetitive, meals were simple, conversations drifted slowly. Travel took long days, and journeys were filled with quiet pauses. Nothing rushed, nothing forced itself forward. Time simply enveloped all activities, moving steadily alongside them. The rhythm of ordinary life remained intact. Sometimes small developments occurred, so minor that they were barely recognized as change. A tool might be slightly improved. A path became smoother where footsteps had repeated most often. Crops were rotated differently. Letters traveled slightly farther. These adjustments happened without fanfare, without announcement, and without expectation. They were the quiet fingerprints of history upon life, noticed only after long periods, and even then only in reflection. People did not frame these moments as historical. They did not know that they were witnesses to what would one day be considered development or evolution. The word history was not in their minds. All that existed was the continuity of daily life, marked by steady repetition and gentle progression. They lived, and time moved quietly past them. Generations came and went. Children grew into adults, learned familiar routines, and took their places in the cycles of work, meals, rest, and travel. Parents aged alongside them, observing changes slowly, but never feeling that the world itself had altered dramatically. The same landscape provided the backdrop for life, repeated through decades. Settlements, modest and unassuming, grew just enough to accommodate new members, yet preserved the same unhurried character. Time left no dramatic signposts. There were no sudden inventions, no immediate transformations, no abrupt shifts in culture or technology. Changes were incremental, almost invisible. Life persisted as it always had, yet when looked back upon after many years, subtle differences became apparent. Tools had improved slightly, crops were slightly more abundant, roads slightly better defined, and households slightly more organized. History unfolded in soft, unremarkable steps. People accepted the slow movement of life. There was no frustration at the absence of speed. There was no disappointment at the lack of excitement. Comfort was found in routine. Predictability provided a sense of security. Days passed, weeks followed, months rolled into years, and years expanded into decades. time continued its quiet march, leaving individuals to live, age, and pass along the same ordinary practices that defined early American life. Even as time moved forward, there was an awareness of continuity. Children inherited the habits of their parents, and their children in turn inherited the same patterns. Knowledge passed quietly from generation to generation. Work practices, meals, social interactions, and seasonal routines remained familiar. Innovations were gradual, almost imperceptible, and yet their accumulation over long periods marked subtle progress. Time itself worked slowly, carefully, without drawing attention to its effects. Seasons repeated their gentle cycles. Spring returned after winter, summer after spring, autumn after summer, winter after autumn, again and again. And as each season passed, time continued its quiet work, leaving the world familiar yet subtly altered. Daily routines persisted unchanged. People woke, worked, ate, rested, and slept with the same patience they had always practiced. Work was repetitive, meals were simple, conversations drifted slowly. Travel took long days, and journeys were filled with quiet pauses. Nothing rushed, nothing